Welcome to Farmers Inside Track. Weekly, we dissect essential components of agricultural practices to empower farmers in Mzansi. I'm your host, Dawn Umdu, and in this episode, we focus on rotational grazing systems. We'll explore how these systems benefit pasture health, enhance livestock productivity, and contributes to the sustainability of agricultural ecosystems. Joining us is Ntokozo Msiza, a PhD candidate in animal science specializing in grass species selection for pasture management.
Ntokozo, welcome to Farmers Inside Track. We are happy to welcome you back to the podcast. It is such a pleasure. You gave us so much insightful information the last time, and we're hoping to dig a little bit deeper into the topic this time around. Welcome back. How have you been?
Thank you so much, Dawn, for having me. I've been good. Can't complain. I've just been having a lot of work, but I've been coping. Thank you so much.
I know people in the agricultural industry, they hardly ever rest. It is difficult for them to rest. There's always lots of work to do, much to be done, but we really do value your contributions, continuous contributions to the sector. Maybe you can tell us briefly about what you do. Also, the topic for today is around rotational grazing techniques, but perhaps you can also just share a little bit more about what we talk about and mean when we say rotational grazing as a start.
Thank you, Dawn. My name is Ntokozo Msiza. I am a pasture scientist by profession, and I am currently doing my fourth year in PhD in animal science at the Northwest University. I am also a part-time lecturer at the University of Fort Hare. And basically, what I do really is research in planted pastures and rangeland ecology. So rotational grazing is basically a grazing system that is used for grazing management, and it usually requires that the grazing is allocated to a group or groups of animals for the entire grazable period, which must be divided into at least one enclosure, or what we would normally call a camp, or it can be more than one camp for a number of animal groups. So, for example, you would have a situation whereby you have one or two pastures that are rested for the entire year, while the remaining pastures are actually grazed seasonally, depending, of course, on the number of pastures and herds that you would be having as a farmer. So with the rotational grazing techniques, it allows for better matching of the livestock's grazing needs with the availability of fodder resources by adjusting the frequency and the timing of those grazing needs. So basically, with the rotational grazing system, it enables the application of these principles of grazing management.
Thank you so much for giving some context to what we're going to be focusing on today. And I agree with you in that these conversations need to be had. I think the learning process and how we consume information can be done in various ways. And this is what we find is valuable for farmers because they're so busy, so they can sit and they can be busy and they can listen to you speaking and gain more insight into the topic. So thank you so much for your time and for agreeing to chat to me. Now, as I mentioned, today we'll be specifically talking about the rotational grazing techniques. And maybe you can just, share information about what the primary benefits are of rotational grazing systems compared to, continuous grazing in terms of pasture health and livestock productivity. And maybe you can just, provide some specific examples in terms of case studies that illustrate these benefits.
When we look at the primary benefits of the rotational grazing systems within the aspect of pasture health is that it basically improves the soil health in the sense that with the rotational grazing technique, it basically allows the pastures to rest and recover, which thereby promotes deeper root growth and it gives a better soil structure. So once the soil structure is actually in a better condition now, it then increases the water infiltration and reduces soil erosion. And then secondly, it enhances the plant diversity in that by moving your livestock regularly, there are different plant species that actually get the opportunity to grow and regrow. This actually leads to a more diverse and resilient pasture ecosystem. And then thirdly, it also reduces the weed pressure in that when there is a well-managed rotational grazing, it can actually help in reducing the weed problems that tend to disturb the most desirable or the most palatable pastures that would be growing within that camp. So it actually helps those pastures to then outcompete these undesirable plants. And then when we look at it from an aspect of livestock productivity, we know that when we have better forage quality within the rotational grazing, we know that it definitely ensures that the livestock have an access to high quality forage. They have access to the most desirable and palatable grasses. It is able to then have a good influence in terms of improving the weight gain of the animals, and in some instances also giving more improved milk production. And then we also look at it in the sense that there's actually reduced diseases and parasites, in that rotating pastures actually breaks the life cycles of many of these parasites, which then leads to much healthier animals. And then thirdly, it improves the manure distribution, in the sense that when the manure is now more evenly spread across the pasture, it is actually able to now enhance the nutrient recycling and soil fertility activity. So there's one case study that I know of, in that in New Zealand, most dairy farmers actually use rotational grazing, have reported that they've actually had up to 20% higher milk yields due to the better forage management of these rotational camps that they use.
Absolutely amazing to actually list it in that way and see how this practice benefits farmers throughout their system and how they run the farm overall. So I think there's definitely much, to be taken note of in this case. How does all of this influence stocking rates and the effectiveness of this rotational grazing systems? Maybe if you can just explain how that correlates.
Before we can maybe delve into the influence and the effectiveness of stocking rate, I think it would be good for us to firstly define and actually understand what we mean when we talk about the stocking rate. The stocking rate is basically the number of animals or the livestock units that are grazing a specific unit of land over a certain period of time. So this is usually expressed as the number of animals per hectare. And then the stocking rate is actually a very critical factor in pasture management, as it determines the balance now between the forage availability and the animal demand, which then ensures the sustainable pasture use and the optimal livestock productivity. So now it's very important for us to again emphasize the fact that stocking rates are critical in rotational grazing, simply because when there is too high a stocking rate, it can definitely lead to overgrazing. It reduces the pasture recovery and the forage quality as well. And at the same time, when there is too low of a stocking rate, it may now not be able to utilize the pasture efficiently, and then it would lead to an underutilized forage, if I can put it that way, and also an uneven manure distribution. So the optimal stocking rate in this case has to balance the forage availability with the livestock needs. So which means, therefore, it is able to ensure that there is a sustainable pasture use, and at the same time, there is a high animal productivity.
You've actually in part, answered my next question, but it specifically also relates to different types of livestock. So what are the key factors to consider when, determining the appropriate stocking rate for different livestock when it comes to assessing your rotational grazing system?
There's basically 5 key elements that a farmer can actually look at, of which the first one would be the forage availability and the growth rate of these pastures. So which means we need to understand the seasonal forage growth for different type of pastures, of which this is what is going to help us to actually set the appropriate stocking rates. And then secondly, we need to understand the animal nutritional requirements, because different animals and breeds actually have different forage needs, which also depend on their production stage, whether that animal is at a gestation stage, whether that animal is at a maintenance stage, or the animal is actually at a reproductive stage. And then thirdly, there's the pasture type. So we need to understand as to which pastures actually are able to support higher stocking rates due to the better forage production, whether it's your grasses or whether it's your pasture legumes, or maybe it's a combination of both. And fourthly, we need to take into consideration the climatic conditions, which is basically us understanding the weather patterns that affect the forage growth And we need to understand how we can then factor that in. And then lastly, we need to look at the soil health and its fertility, because we know that if your soils are actually at a healthy stage, we know that they are actually able to support higher stocking rates.
I must say that I'm learning so much about this topic. Now, we spoke about kind of understanding that there are recovery periods, but maybe you can just talk about optimal pasture recovery periods in a rotational grazing system, and how do these periods vary based on pasture type? And you just mentioned climatic conditions. And if you can describe how these recovery periods impact both quality, pasture quality, and livestock health overall.
When we look at the optimal recovery periods, we are basically also putting into consideration as to what type of pastures are these. Are these cool season pastures? Are these warm season pastures? Or is it probably a mix of these pastures? For instance, if we talk about the cool season grasses, for example, those would be your ray grass, those would be your cocksfoot grass, your tall fuscus grass. So these ones would typically require a recovery period of about 20 to 30 days, which would be enough time for them to actually have an opportunity to regrow once you would have allowed your animals to go inside those camps and actually graze those grasses. And then when we look at the warm season grasses, those would be grasses such as your Rhodes grass, your Panicum maximum, your Sandgrass ciliaris grasses. Those would typically need about 30 to 60 days to recover, because I guess they would probably need from the soil, from the roots, so that they can be able to put most of their resources into regrowing again. So they need a bit more time as compared to the cool season grasses. And then in a situation whereby you have mixed pastures, whether it be your warm season grasses and some other pastures. So with that one, it's going to vary based on which species would be dominant within that camp, and also being able to understand the growth patterns of those mixed pastures would actually then be able to help you to understand as to, are you going to leave those pastures to recover for a period of 20 to 30 days or even more. And then when it comes to the impact on the pasture quality and the livestock health, is that when it comes to the quality, we basically look at the adequate recovery, which ensures that there's high quality forage, and that at the same time, the nutritional value of those pastures is also maintained. When it comes to the health aspect, we basically look at, preventing overgrazing, because when you allow that particular period for the pastures to actually regrow, you are actually trying to reduce the stress on the plants and the animals as well, which then will be able to lead to a better livestock health in general. And then when it comes to understanding the pasture type, it simply means that with different grasses and pasture legumes, we need to know the different growth rates and the recovery needs, so that we can be able to find a balance between us allowing these pastures to rest and also allowing those pastures to be able to give what these animals need in terms of their nutrition. And then also looking at the climate, when it comes to the recovery periods, it can be shorter in optimal growing conditions, and at the same time, it can be longer in drought or cold conditions.
Because now, in terms of sustainability, how does rotational grazing compare to other grazing methods for various types of, livestock, that's cattle, sheep, or goats? And are there specific breeds or species of livestock that particularly benefit from rotational grazing?
When we now compare the different grazing systems, when we basically look at the one talking about now, the rotational grazing, we would understand that it basically enhances the soil health. It gives an improved water retention and also biodiversity. So it is basically suitable for all livestock types, but it is particularly beneficial for animals that are prone to parasites, such as your sheep and goats. And then when we look at continuous grazing, we know that continuous grazing, because with that one, it does not specifically focus on the camps the way rotational grazing does. So with continuous grazing, there's basically no camps. So once it's like that, it can lead to soil degradation, and it also reduces the biodiversity. So which means it is actually less effective in controlling parasites. And then we have the third one, which is the short duration grazing. So this one basically involves a very high stocking density for short periods of time. And with this one, it basically promotes soil health and the forage growth, but it does require very careful management around it. The breeds or animals that normally benefit from this type of grazing systems, it's mostly your cattle. And with cattle, they benefit from the improved forage quality and also the reduced parasite load. And then secondly, it's your sheep and goats, and where they normally benefit from the parasite control and the diverse forage that would be there within those grazing systems.
Are there any common challenges or misconceptions associated with implementing rotational grazing systems? And if so, how do you suggest, it can be addressed?
Challenges and misconceptions are there. And one of those challenges, of course, is that these kind of systems are actually very expensive to develop, as they require fencing of camps and development of water facilities, in the sense that within those camps, you would actually need to have quite a few of those watering facilities for your animals. And the fact that it needs high level of management, which is mostly required for decision making when it comes to stocking rates and the movements of these animals from different paddocks. And the fact that there's there's a high initial cost and labor. But now when you look at the long-term benefits, they actually outweigh the initial investments that you would actually have to put in. So, when it comes to the aspect of cost sharing, we need those type of awareness, those type of educational programs whereby we can actually share with farmers as to how they can handle that. And then with many people, they believe that these type of grazing systems are actually very complex. But I believe that with proper planning and better farmer education, these type of systems can actually be simplified, and that is where you can be able to understand that it's actually not as complicated to implement. And then there's also overgrazing concerns, of which I believe that it's only a matter of understandings, because I believe that if there is proper planning and there is consistent monitoring of these grazing systems, they can actually be good decision making when it comes to rotational grazing and other, grazing systems that are actually implemented by farmers.
And then, of course, you and I both understand and know that, incorporating technology and technological advancements is something that we should really consider, in terms of our farming practices generally. Do you know of any tech tools that can assist farmers, in managing the rotational grazing more effectively?
When it comes to technological advancements, it's basically those things that can be able to make the whole system of doing these grazing systems to be a bit more easier for us. I believe there's a grazing management software, which is called pasture. So with pasture, it's able to help you plan and actually track the grazing rotations that you would be planning to put your livestock into. And then there's also the GPS collars and the virtual fencing. So these ones, they basically allow for precise control of your livestock movement without actually having a physical fence. And then the third one, it's the soil and the forage sensors, of which with these ones, they're actually able to provide real-time data on the soil health and the forage growth that would be happening within your camps, of which this actually aids in making proper and more sound decisions.
You've given us so much to think about on this topic. I'm looking forward to sharing all of this information with our farmers. My last question, and something I think you've covered throughout the discussion, which how does rotational grazing, contribute to overall sustainability of agricultural ecosystems? I think you've highlighted this throughout, but if you can just specifically point out a few points that you'd like to share. Thank you so much, Ntokozo.
There's basically 4 elements that we can look at. And the first one is the enhanced soil health, of which it's very important because if your soil is not in a healthy state, then trust me, there are no pastures that are going to be there. With the enhanced soil health, it basically promotes for better soil structure, water retention, and nutrients cycling. And then the second one is biodiversity. So with biodiversity, it basically helps to support the diverse pasture species that would be there. They are beneficial not only to the livestock, but also to the insects and to other wildlife animals. And then thirdly, there's the carbon sequestration. We would know that healthy pastures basically need more carbon, and through mitigating climate change, when you have good field management practices, they actually can conserve and enhance those carbon storage in your field. So which means you are basically in a situation whereby you are forming soil organic matter, which will therefore further present your losses of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And that is actually going to help to mitigate the climate change while enhancing sustainability for other future climate change scenarios. And then the last one, which is the fourth one, it would be resilience. So it basically creates more resilient agricultural systems, which then means that is going to be better able to withstand extreme climatic conditions and also, weathers that are fluctuating almost every day.
Thank you so much for your time, Ntokozo. I think this is such a valuable topic to share with farmers throughout Mzansi and elsewhere in the world. We really do appreciate you taking the time to chat to us. Is there anything that you'd like to share in closing as we wrap up the conversation today? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dawn, for having me again. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to actually share my thoughts around rotational grazing techniques. So I would just like to share with farmers some of the advantages and disadvantages, of course, of using these rotational grazing techniques. And also, I'm also just going to give some of the requirements that I needed for rotational grazing to be an effective system that any farmer can be able to implement. So firstly, let me actually just start with the disadvantages. So when it comes to the disadvantages, of course, there is a lot of labor that goes into rotational grazing. There's high maintenance and also it's capital intensive, especially when it comes to having to erect fences and having those watering points. And then animals are restricted to grazing within a camp, which when natural or field resources are actually depleted, it does require an expert to actually guide the animal movements to other alternative camps. And you find that it is time consuming in terms of monitoring the field. You find that livestock condition and infrastructure intactness needs to be done. Animals that are confined to graze on one available forages in the camp. And then in cases where the stocking rates are actually underestimated, you find that the field and the animal's condition will deteriorate. And then some of the advantages, of course, that are there is that the farmer has control over the length of time that the animals are able to be in the field, and you are also able to control their absence. And the system actually allows for utilizing the field sparingly to cater for the periods of feed shortage, such as your winter or during periods of drought. And then animals, whether they're in the breeding, calving, or whichever stage that they're in, including the field management, such as your field grazing, your resting, and your burning, those type of practices are actually able to be carried out effectively. And then the farmer is actually able to know where his or her animals are grazing and at what point and at what time. And then when it comes to the requirements to effectively implement this technique, as a farmer, you need to make sure that there is at least one extra well-fenced camp or grazing area, which is more than each number of the animal herds that you'd be having at that time. And then you need a fire belt bordering each of those camps to avoid accidental fires. You need the watering points in each of those camps so that animals are actually able to access that water. And then you also need supplementary feeding troughs in each of those grazing areas. And you need a well-located kraal and crush pens to ensure that there is proper animal management. And that would include your dipping, your vaccination, your weighing, and also your recording. And then lastly, when it comes to the stocking rate and the carrying capacity, it needs to be in accordance with the period of occupation of those animals within each camp.
Thank you so much for your time, Ntokozo Msiza, a PhD candidate in animal science, specializing in grass species selection for pasture management. She joined us a few weeks ago to explain the connection between grass species and pasture management, so keep on scrolling for more. And for any additional insights on optimizing your agricultural practices, visit www.foodformzansi.co.za. Remember to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with fellow agricultural enthusiasts. From me, Donumdu, our technical producer Megan van der Vent, and the rest of the hashtag Team Foodformzansi, until next time, happy farming.
Life in South Africa can be a lot. I mean, scroll through Twitter for a minute and tell me I'm wrong. Thank God for South Africans though, right? We're inspiring, and even on the bad days, we fight back with a smile. That's why I love Foodformzansi so much. We're not ashamed to celebrate the ordinary unsung heroes who work every day to put food on our nation's tables. Go to foodformzansi.co.za and never miss an inspiring story.